guys ready? My time starts now. We post a resolution that refugee restrictions in developed countries are permissible. According to the 1967 OAU Convention, a refugee is an individual owing to external aggression, occupation, foreign domination, or events seriously disturbing public order in either part or whole of his country or of origin or nationality. According to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, restrictions is defined as limiting condition or measure, especially a legal one. Developed countries are those which have a relatively high level of industrialization and standard of living. Permissible is must consider to be acceptable by law. Acceptable is agreed to consider it, use it, and allow it to happen. Framework. Pro has the burden to explain how restrictions will lead to better consequences, and we think we will win this debate if they would fail to explain. Contention 1, international law. According to Human Hater of International Development Research Fellow, IHL applies to all governments. International refugee applies to states that are party to relevant treaties to all states under customary law. Having such a widespread of application, the international law strongly set legal obligations below for states. A, non-refoulement. Principles adopted by the AALCC in 1966, no one seeking asylum in accordance with these principles should be rejected at the frontier, returned, or repulsion, which could result in compelling him to stay in a territory if there is a well-founded fear of persecution, danger of his life, physical integrity, or liberty at that territory. Since then, restrictions aiming to restrict the refugees from entering the states are totally not legally permissible. B, protection to human rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights stipulates some rights that are applicable without discrimination, such as the right to a nationality, freedom, and residence. Moreover, the protection of children seeking refugee is guaranteed by R22 Convention on the Rights of the Child. Given these conventions and laws, any restriction that threatens the human rights of the refugees, for example, restriction to employment, is not ethically permissible. Contention 2, humanitarianism. According to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, humanitarianism is a doctrine that humanity's obligations are concerned wholly with the welfare of the human race. To feel empathy with suffering of another person, a person who is not like ourselves, is part of being human. The problems that refugees meet is magnified when countries erect restrictions, as people will take greater risks and are more vulnerable to disease, family separation, and human abuses. Pope Francis, the first ever leader of the Roman Catholic Church, reminds us of the golden rule. Let us treat others with the same passion and compassion which we want to be treated. We must not be taken aback by their numbers, but rather view them as persons. Only about 30 countries offer resettlement places for vulnerable refugees, and the number of places offered is far shorter than the needs identified by the UNHCR. So absent a safe haven in Europe or the United States, many refugees will continue to suffer, which clearly shows that further refugee restrictions are not morally permissible. Contention 3. Refugee restrictions are the reason why their journey is so dangerous. This situation is a logical extension of the Fortress Europe mentality. These gangs have shot at refugees, and others have drowned during panics when approached violently by these gangs. Though various barriers do not curb irregular migration, but only serve to increase the death toll and do not stop refugees from trying to get around these obstacles. A Europe-wide agreement could easily and definitely define an asylum seeker and standardize legal rights and standards for their reception and treatment, but the future is more likely to have more fences and restrictions. In the current EU meeting in Estonia, responses to the refugee crisis says that as long as migrants are forced to resort to smugglers for lack of legal pathways, proactive search and rescue at sea will be a humanitarian necessity. Only fundamental reorientation of the EU's migration policies to grant legal and safe passage may bring the smuggling business, the daily reality of thousands of migrants in distress, and the need to rescue them at the end. Thank you.
Judges ready, homes ready, partner ready. My time begins now. Framework. Under the 1951 UN Convention, a refugee is defined as a person who is outside of his or her country and unable to be protected by that country owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. In ethics, in the first person, Danny Elliott defines permissibility. A moral system differentiates among behaviors that are morally prohibited, morally permitted, morally required, and morally encouraged. This debate is about morally permitted, which is a neutral perspective. In practice, moral permissibility does not have to draw positive consequences, and it grants legitimate freedom, while what is morally impermissible can be absolutely not tolerated, and its tolerance would mean abandoning the fundamental principle of moral evaluation evaluation which renders punishments. Therefore, the question of this debate is not whether states should be discouraged from restricting refugees, but can restrictions that protect both national citizens and refugees be tolerated? We do not need to defend for all refugee restrictions, therefore we don't have to defend current possible restrictions, as it is only supposed to be permissible on balance. We win the debate if we prove that some refugee restrictions are morally understandable and not against international law. Contention 1, restrictions are not violating the moral standard in international law. First, resettling refugees massively increases the risk of high-profile terrorist attacks like the one in Paris. In November 2015, ISIS killed 130 and injured 368 in coordinated attacks across Paris. It proved disturbingly simple for these ISIS members to conceal themselves among genuine refugees. The impact is obvious among Europe. Asylum seekers struck an ISIS name in Berlin, Stockholm, London, and other Western European cities. This terrorist threat in Europe has increased as a direct result of immigration and open border policy. Second, health check as another form of restriction is of crucial importance for both citizens and refugees. This type of check, according to the Refugee Health Technical Assistance Center, can reduce the possibility of people around them catching infectious disease. Precautions such as health check, safety, and security check are other reasonable ways to avoid potential sanitary and physical risk. If some refugee with malaria enters your borderline, it is very likely that the disease would spread and cause great harm. It is an obligation for nations to keep their citizens safe, so restrictions of this kind will be necessary. Therefore, the refugee restrictions keep these uncertainties away, and they are actually moral actions which enhance the security and living standard for both national citizens and accepted refugees. Contention 2, international law does not specify how the country should help the refugee. First, the creators of the Refugee Convention intentionally avoided creating an obligation to resettle refugees declared under 2017. For refugees, the potential to establish a positive obligation on states to generally cooperate or to assist overburdened host states was briefly mentioned by other delegations only with a view to clearly reject any such consequences. The reference to the redistribution of refugees throughout the world was removed by the drafting committee, leaving simply the reference to international cooperation without further elaboration. This appears to remove any implication that states will be required to participate in the physical distribution of refugees. Second, international law doesn't include a mechanism for enforcement and only applies to states that consent to it. Dr. Andrew Guzman, JD, PhD from Harvard, 2011. The signature feature of international law is a lack of coercive enforcement. This reality makes compliance with international law doubtful. Imposing rules on states without their consent creates the risk that the rules will be ignored. The consent limits international law rules mainly to the states that have agreed to accept. The committed states include both developed countries like France and developing countries like Turkey. Hence, international law itself has weak enforcement. Even if states have to obey it, the developing countries are also obliged to do so. Third, there is humanitarian assistance now, and more should certainly be provided by governments. The United States has spent over $219 million, more than twice that of any country, in funding for the UNHCR. Therefore, refugee restrictions don't violate international law that has weak compliance from states. Countries indeed have the obligation to help the refugees, yet the measure of helping might be different from nation to nation. Condition 3, moral obligation. John Arthur, 1984. Humans have entitlements. These fall into two broad categories, rights and desert. Here's parallelism. All of us can help others by giving away or allowing others to use their body. While your life may be shortened by the loss of a kidney, the cost is probably not comparable to the loss experienced by a person who will die without the kidney. However, such heroism is obviously not required. We are entitled to keep our kidneys. The reason for this is often expressed in terms of rights. It's your body, you have a right to, and that weighs against whatever duty you have to help. The same theory applies to states in that they have the freedom to not sacrifice the rights of national citizens and accepted refugees, and it is permissible to place restrictions. We therefore affirm that refugee restrictions are permissible according to the reasons above.
Start now. So I may ask the first question. So what are your alternatives to solve this refugee crisis?
Well, we keep reasonable restrictions and we provide financial help to those neighboring countries so that they can take better care of refugees in their country.
But we have a card that says neighboring countries account for less than 2.5% of the world GDP and taking 46% of the world's refugees. It's a big burden, right?
Yeah, that's why we have to help them. Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So we do both agree on the definition of restrictions, correct? The Merriam-Webster definition?
Yes.
Yes.
Limited condition or measure, especially illegal.
Yes. Do you guys consider the health check to be a refugee restriction? Or basically screening for health and terrorism? Would you consider that to be a restriction? Okay. Well, if you don't have an answer, you can ask us a question.
You talked about in your contingent one. You talked about Paris. Can I ask you how many people in this terrorist attack are refugees?
Well, the fact remains that these ISIS members, they concealed themselves among genuine refugees. They used refugees to conduct the attack. So the problem of refugees causing more terrorism still stands.
But according to our data, that only 6 out of 7 people in this attack are refugees. The others
So
are...
that means they were refugees who were involved in the
6
attack,
out of
correct?
7 people are not refugees, and the rest are aboriginals.
Aboriginals? So there are still refugees involved in the attack, correct? You said 6 out of 7, that means there was someone.
Yes.
So that means the threat still stands. Can I ask a question?
Yes.
We both agree that countries have a certain moral obligation to help these refugees, correct?
Yes.
So that would mean if these restrictions actually do help refugees, then we are right.
We can not only care about our own nations. America dropped a nuclear bomb in Japan, causing thousands of deaths. Even in wartime towards enemies, this protection in international law is cruel. How in morality can we let international interests make us ignore the pain of help leaders?
Okay, I never mentioned national interests and dropping a bomb in Japan.
But you talked about morality, right?
Yes. So, I mean, we're saying that these restrictions, they help those refugees who are affected and help national citizens. And you can't just ignore the rights of national citizens. They are also human too. They have the same rights as
But you
refugees.
also can't ignore the rights of the refugees, right?
No, we're not. We're protecting these accepted refugees from disease and terrorists by screening for them.
In
How is
neighboring
that-
countries.
No, from entering the countries. From entering the developed countries. Thank you.
And 30 seconds. So, almost ready? Just ready? Partners ready? Okay, so my time starts now. Sorry. Okay. So I'm going to start from your first contention. Your first contention is saying that excluding the refugees, setting restrictions to them does not violate the law. But according to our contention 1, the principle of non-restriction according to AALCC in 1963 says you cannot expel or return the refugees not only into their original country, but also to any country, any state that they will receive any persecution or suffer any diseases. So that you are saying that you are not violating the law, but you are actually violating the principle of non-refoulement. And you said that terrorism may be a problem, but first you said ISIS console themselves as refugees. But first, we have a vetting system, and the vetting system has successfully screened only 1 million terrorists who pretend himself to be a refugee enter the Europe, and he is detected later. So that vetting system is already very efficient to prevent them from entering the country. Why should you exclude all the refugees? Because the possibility that they are terrorists. And second, you mentioned in the Paris evidence, 6 out of 7 of them are not refugees. They are French, they're from Belgium, and they're local citizens. So you blame the whole refugee group for this 1 out of 7, ignoring that the refugees actually, they are the biggest victims of the terrorism. They escape from their country, they're expelled from their country because they suffer terrorism. They're actually victims. And also, excluding the refugees is exactly what ISIS wants you to do, because excluding the refugees shows your alienation to those refugees, and you are pushing the refugees towards the side of the terrorists. You are turning the innocent, good refugees, Muslims, to Islamic fundamentalists, for example. And also, you said about the health problem, the diseases. So you're going to say that because of malaria, because of the diseases they bring, you are going to exclude them? because they are you, and you said it, you are helping them. No, you are just sending them to the developing countries. And for the alternative, there is also a very severe question that if you send those people to bring disease to the developing countries, the developing countries also will suffer the diseases. Why do you provide this alternative? And second, for a second condition, you said it is not your obligation, but actually, according to our non-refoulement principle, you are obligated to not send them back, to not expel them, so that no obligation does not make sense. It is only that the international law, the lack of a coercive enforcement that requires you, because the UN does not have any merely any coercive power. But it doesn't mean that you can disobey it, because it is a law and it is for humanitarianism. The law is made to save many people, and you just ignore the law because you are afraid of being attacked by terrorists, and we already substantiated that it is wrong. And for your alternative, that you will send them to neighboring countries, but the developing countries, they are more poorer than you. If you send them to these countries, the neighboring countries actually will collapse. Will happen something that you fear, and these things will be more severe than what may happen in your country. So that if these countries collapse, there will be more war, more refugees, more terrorism, and it will make the consequences even worse. Thank you.
Okay. So, just ready? Just ready? Opponents ready? Point ready? My rebuttal speech starts now. Okay, so based on my opponent's points and our points, we're going to give the following rebuttals. So first one is about a framework. So we both agree that as for restrictions should be either permissible or not permissible, it should be both morally accepted and legally accepted. So that is our common ground, and then we have a clear definition about it. So, and according to our framework, we believe that as long as there are some of the permissions are permissible, that means the permissions are permissible. We don't have to show that every restrictions are permissible to show that we win. And actually, and they have mentioned that every nation has the obligation to help those refugees. Well, yes. Well, the national law never states, and especially and up to 2017, they never states that how the different nations are going to help those refugees. They can donate money, they can provide camps, or they can resettle them in different ways. So there's no clear form of obligation of whatever form of help they should give to those people. And secondly, you said just why they have a disease, you can let them out. It's kind of a not moral behavior. Well, that is not the case. You can come. Here's a comparison of impact. So first, just thinking that someone who has malaria enters our country because he has no restrictions, and then he's going to affect all of those people who do. Because malaria doesn't have a vaccine, so it is going to affect all the people around him, and that is going to cause either harm to your refugees and to those refugees who are accepted, and also the citizens who are sort of living, and that is harming both the rights of the refugees and the rights of the citizens, and that is in the international law, as I mentioned just now, because they have the rights to protect them from being harmed, so to keep them safe and sound. And also you said, oh yeah, there's no terrorism because we have vetting, and isn't vetting a kind of restriction that you're kind of letting certain people out of the country by using kind of certain law rules? That is called, so it is actually controversial between your arguments, because they were saying, oh, we're using vetting to prevent terrorists from entering our country, while vetting exactly is a kind of restriction, just like health check. And also they have mentioned about EU migration laws that is making those refugees moving to other places hard or impossible. Well, there's a difference between immigrants and refugees, and you haven't given us a clear definition of the difference between immigrants and refugees. So I have reasons to believe that the refugees restrictions are different from the immigrants restrictions. And also based on the danger of the journey, we have reason to believe that it's easier for them to actually move to a place that is closer to a country which provides refugees. So that is actually more helpful and provides less harm for the refugees. And Yeah, and moving on to the A's, you said that we have proved a weak alternative. Well, that's not the case. The first one, we don't actually need to defend our alternatives because we only need to prove that some of the restrictions are permissible. And secondly, according to about our alternative, we can provide financial aids which are critically important to those countries who actually accept the refugees and also to the victim country. Because in this way, we can provide them with education, we can provide them with better living status, and we can actually enhance the living conditions in the refugee camps. And that is all going to help what they are actually suffering now. Because letting those people to, for example, developed countries, as you said, is actually they cannot get a job because they have got no adequate education and they cannot speak the language. And how are they going to help? So it's better to actually provide you with education, with basic facilities, so that actually they can get a job when they have our countries back or they move to another country. And that's the reason why we believe that having some restrictions are actually good for the refugees and for those citizens in the nations. Thank you.
Okay. So by giving the compare about losing a kidney or an eye to setting the restrictions, you're saying that it is a heroism that you are not obligated to do so. But heroism actually means something moral, something if you do, you are morally very good. So are you saying that the refugees restrictions, accepting the refugees are actually moral?
Yeah, accepting refugees is a moral behavior.
So is
So is this your question? So I'm asking mine. So how would you distinguish an immigrant and a refugee? Because you said the EU policies are mostly for immigrants instead of refugees. So how is that linked to the refugee case?
When do we mention?
In the last contention about they are having a tough journey to those developed countries, and you are talking about EU immigrants policies.
No, our third contention is that if you exclude them outside your border, there will be many persecution. For example, some
and that's the kind of certain restrictions that is going to stop them from going to the developed country, right?
what restriction that will stop them from?
That's going to stop them from entering the developed countries.
No, if you exclude them, if you don't protect them, they will suffer from the danger in the journey. So it is time for me to ask my question. You said in your definition that permissible include an argument for morally permissible. So, and you said that accepting those refugees, they are moral. So are you saying that it is permissible?
Yes, accepting of refugees is permissible, but you do need to have some restrictions to prevent the good things to become a bad thing. If they have kind of certain disease with the refugees carrying, how is it going to help? How is it going to help both the refugees and the citizens? And I have a question for you. So about vetting, you said vetting can actually prevent terrorism from entering a country. So is vetting a kind of my question is vetting a kind of restriction?
No, it is not a kind of
Why is
restriction.
that not a restriction?
Because restriction means that you...
According to our definition, restriction means a set of rules or laws that actually can limit what you can do and what you cannot. And banning, the motive for banning is like to actually let them get in or get out of the country. So that in that way, banning is a kind of restriction. So why is that not?
Because using vetting, we accept those refugees, but we exclude those terrorists that conceal them as refugees.
Yes, isn't that
so that this is not a restriction to the refugees. This is a restriction to the terrorists that pretend them to be refugees.
So you want to distinguish about the refugee and the terrorist, you need banning, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, banning is a kind of restriction.
No. I restrict.
So it's time for you to ask my question. To ask.
No, my response I've not already finished. Actually, this restriction, you said restrictions, the title is the restrictions to refugees are permissible, but in here, the vetting is the restriction to those terrorists who pretend them to be refugees. It is not refugees.
Okay, thank you.
30 seconds. starts now. So first with our opponent's contention. Their contention one is restrictions will not violate the law. But according to our law, ALCC, no one, it applies to all states, and no one seeking asylum in accordance with these principles should be rejected at the frontier, return or repulsion, which could result in compelling him to stay in a territory if there is a well-founded fear of persecution, endangering his life, physical integrity, or liberty in that territory, and that includes war refugees. And they talked about Paris, but 6 out of 7 people are not refugees in this attack, and you shouldn't blame the whole refugee group because of this one attack. And the vetting system is very thorough. Not a single refugee has committed a terrorist attack in the U.S. One person who disguised himself as a refugee entered Europe this year out of 1 million. And and about terrorism, the root of terrorism is not people from places that have terrorism. Instead, it's the source of terrorism in this extreme cultures. This proves that we cannot blame refugees for terrorism. On the contrary, we should help them with our biggest effort because most of them themselves are helpless victims of terrorism. And you also talked about diseases. But you can't exclude them because of diseases. And your second contention is about international law. Since our opponents haven't stated a law that is more authoritative than the United Nations, we win this point. So restrictions are not morally and legally permissible. Your contention 3 says that no obligation to care for the refugees, but according to our non-refoulement law that applies to all states, this point doesn't stand. You talked about alternatives, letting them enter developing countries, and if these refugees enter developing countries, it will collapse the entire economy and result in more refugees and more terrorism. And these 10 countries, which account for less than 2.5% of the world GDP, will take in 56% of the world's refugees. And about our first contention, like I said, since our opponents haven't stated a law that is more authoritative, we win this point. Our second contention is about humanitarianism, and they only stated about the rights of their own citizens and not about the...
Okay. 2 minutes, my time. My time begins now. Okay, first of all, they've been talking all day about the right of non-refoulement and how every single country has to agree with this, which is true because it's a Jewish code, right? However, we never said that we'd send these people back to war-torn areas. We never said they would send them back to those areas. So it is not a violation of non-refoulement. So therefore, any claims that they win on the law is invalid. Also, if I recall, he said something that we had a kidney and an eye example, which is not true. We did not mention anything about eyes, so they are twisting our words. And also, they still have not provided a difference between immigrants and refugees. And actually, our measures, they are morally correct because we are helping refugees. If you let terrorists and people with disease into the country, you are hurting those refugees who are accepted in addition to national citizens. And as we all know, we have to treat everybody equally. Also, we never said that we would completely exclude these people with disease into the country. If they are actual refugees and they have some curable disease, since developed countries, as you guys probably agree, they have more resources, we can help cure them. And also, he said something that like, oh, you're only getting rid of those terrorists disguised as refugees, therefore the vetting is not a restriction. However, you guys also said that a refugee participated in the Paris attack. Therefore, there was a refugee who was a terrorist, and therefore there is a risk that refugees might be terrorists. So therefore, vetting is a restriction on refugees. And also, if you let terrorists, or if you just don't care about terrorists and you just let all refugees come inside, actually more refugees, they might become terrorists. You did not disprove this. You only said that if they're outside, they might become terrorists. But actually, the chance of them becoming terrorists while inside a developed country is very huge because there are a lot of developed countries that are moving towards the far right, and there's a lot of backlash against Muslims and refugees. And actually, after receiving all this discrimination, these refugees may become more extreme and become more likely to be terrorists. Thank you.
So the first question, you are saying that you are not violating the non-refoulement rule, but according to our source from Asian African Legal Consultative Committee, no one seeking asylum in accordance with these principles should be expelled or returned back to not only those original countries, but also any country, like their neighboring countries, that they may receive persecution. How can you explain this, that this is not a law violation?
Well, first